me to write this article, and that's because I think that a lot of the time people at the moment, they talk about a resurgence of the far right in Britain, and to be honest, I think it's much more significant and much more serious than that. In terms of what we're seeing in terms of the development of a far right street movement in Britain, I think it's really a historic peak in terms of the capacity of that movement to sustain mobilisation, to engage in intimidatory protests, and to do this over a wide geographical spread. I mean, obviously, the moment where this really crystallised was in the riots in August 2024, after the events in Southport, where there was riots across England. But after that, really, this far-right street movement has proved that it is capable of consistently organising across the country, particularly after the protests last year, which began in July in Epping and then spread to towns and cities across the country. And in some of those places, those protests are going on, despite the fact that there's been the evolution of an anti-fascist response to them, which in many ways has sort of contained them. And to me, this seemed like an extraordinarily worrying, but also interesting and deserving of investigation phenomenon. And yet, when you read journalism about these events, when you read commentary about these events, actually I think that what you find is that the movement is incredibly poorly understood and poorly analysed, and there's really not a great deal of academic research or journalistic comment and so on, which actually looks at the granular detail of how these people are organising, what their movement is saying, and what the political project behind this movement is. And in many ways, the dominant account of what is motivating and animating this far-right street movement is about, austerity, about the idea of sections of the population becoming socially marginalised, and about the way in which the racist rhetoric of successive Tory governments, as well as Reform UK, has sort of produced a toxic atmosphere in British society, which has allowed these sorts of forces to grow. Now, let me be absolutely clear, those are obviously really, really important parts of the picture, but at the same time, I think that if the analysis stops there, then it can be actually quite dangerous, because it presents the riots, the protests outside of asylum seeker accommodation, the arson attacks on asylum seeker accommodation, the intimidatory protests, the assaults against people from racialised minorities and so on, as almost like pre-political, as just sort of emotional outbursts, and then they tend to ignore the degree to which actually these are motivated at their heart by a sort of coherent political project. And in this way, they can actually feed off of the self-presentation of that movement. Robinson and this movement, they say, we're just, honest, naive, representatives of the voice of the marginalised white working class who are angry and so on, and no one is listening to us and all of this sort of stuff. And so this is what really led me to an interest in the figure of Tommy Robinson. Robinson has been the leading far-right street activist in Britain for something like 15 years now. Anyone who's been to one of these racist protests or has been to counter demonstrations against them will have heard that completely ridiculous chant every single time, "Oh, Tommy, Tommy." He is the figurehead of this movement. He is an animating force within it, and really the crowning achievement, if you want to put it like that, of this far-right street movement as it's developed over the past few years was that demonstration on the 30th of September last year, a complete earthquake in British politics, and the biggest fascist-led mobilisation in British history, in truth, quite easily. 110,000 people marching on the streets of London behind Tommy Robinson with a banner saying "Remigration Now," which, by the way, translates to ethnic cleansing of Britain now. Far, far bigger than, for example, the infamous Olympia rally, coordinated by the British Union of Fascists in 1934, which was the previous largest fascist-led mobilisation in British history. And so it's shocking, really, that given his importance in this moment, given the historical nature of these developments on the British far right, the reporting and commentary on Robinson and that demonstration was frankly quite superficial. You know, there was reports about it in the media, but it seemed like none of the journalists had even gone to it, hadn't listened to the speeches, hadn't listened to the many podcasts which he has produced, haven't read the books which he's written over the past few years. And as I say, I understand why you wouldn't want to do that, right? It's not the best thing for your psychological health, but this is a real phenomenon, and it deserves serious attention. And this is important because it obscures central aspects of what Robinson is doing. You see, I write in the article that many people refer to Robinson as a grifter, as an Islamophobe, as a thug, as a racist, and let me be clear, he is all of these things. He is all of these things to the most extreme extent, and it's a matter of public record. The fraud, the way in which he constantly asks for money from his supporters, despite the fact that it's also on the record that he's snorting huge amounts of cocaine at the same time. You know, the racism, the history of leading confrontational, violent, racist demonstrations that have attacked people from minority groups and so on. But the more that you engage with his project, the more you map how these demonstrations and movement is playing out, the more you listen to his speeches, the more you realise that there is a coherent project behind this that isn't merely, you know, financially fleecing his supporters and encouraging racism. And I call that project fascism. I call that project fascism. And this is a contentious point. For example, the anti-fascist research organisation Hope Not Hate, as they say in the article, wrote an article some time ago now, but I don't know whether they've changed their position, I don't think that they have, in which they said that it would be wrong to label him a fascist. And there is a real debate out there about whether it is right to use this label as a description of him. Now, my view is that this confusion has very, very deep roots in the way in which fascism has been interpreted and understood, both at the popular level, amongst the mass of the public, but also in academic discussions, in what's known as far-right studies inside of the academy. As a detail in the article, academic understandings of fascism tend to be dominated by what I refer to as a checklist approach, where basically you have a checklist of ideological commitments, maybe iconography, forms of organisation, but typically ideological commitments, and you look at a party or you look at a movement and you say, do they believe this? Do they believe that? And if you check enough boxes, then that means that the label of fascism can be applied to them. And primarily, actually, people often think about fascism simply in terms of Nazism. Is the organisation anti-Semitic? Does it articulate ideological beliefs which are in some way a hangover from the Nazi period? And I think that this is a static approach, and it's a backward-looking understanding of the nature of fascism. It's inappropriate to the object of study, if I can put it like that, and it also means that you always identify fascism too late, because you're always looking at the last iteration of it and you're not looking at what's in front of your face. We will always be looking for the swastikas, for the torchlit rallies, and all of this sort of stuff. We will be ignoring the fascism that is right in front of us, because the truth is that fascism throughout its history is highly adaptive. It's opportunistic. Simply put, fascists are liars. They're liars. They will constantly change their stated public beliefs, misrepresent what they believe, in order to mask their relationship to the most discredited forms of historic fascism, particularly after the Holocaust. Constantly looking for ways to distance themselves from that discredited tradition in such a way that they can present themselves as a new force in society which isn't tied to that. Moreover, if you look at the historical experience of fascism, it never creates its ideology from scratch. We'll take the Nazis, for example. The Nazis didn't invent anti-Semitism in German society. They didn't invent eugenics. They didn't invent the notion of European racial supremacy. These were ambient ideas which existed within German society from the creation of the state of Germany in 1871, which were historically rooted in colonialism, in the German colonization of Africa, for example, rooted in the legacy of black slavery, rooted in the construction of German nationalism when the state was created at the end of the 19th century. And the Nazis simply radicalized these ideological trends. This is a key argument. Fascism always takes the existing right-wing store of discursive resources, of ideas, of ideological commitments, and what it does is radicalise them. It doesn't generate them out of nothing. And as I detail in the article, you know, Robinson has been incredibly adept at, for example, using loud support for the state of Israel to deflect accusations that he's a fascist and to sort of distance himself from the traditional neo-Nazi currents in British fascism that are associated, for example, with Nick Griffin, the British National Party, the National Front, and all of this sort of stuff. And this has caused real confusion, right? It's caused real confusion. I refer to this in the article as Tommy Robinson's strategic Zionism. He associates himself with Zionism because he believes that somehow this means that you couldn't possibly be anti-Semitic. There's a whole history here, of course. You know, Balfour, instrumental in the setting up of the State of Israel, at the same time extremely anti-Semitic, introduced legislation in order to stop Jewish people coming to Britain. But we'll leave that to one side. Anti-Semitism is not actually an essential aspect of fascism, historically speaking. People believe that it is because the sort of ideal type of fascism in a lot of people's heads is Nazism, right? And Nazism was a political project which, to a greater or lesser extent, was built centrally around this idea of anti-Semitism. Yet if you look at other projects, fascist projects, even at the time, what you know, I've been talking to people about recently as the lesser-known fascisms of that period, you find that anti-Semitism isn't necessarily a salient aspect of them. So, for example, Austro-fascism in Austria at that time, the Catholic fascism of the Marxist movement in Belgium at that time, even Mussolini's Italian fascism in the 1920s, anti-Semitism isn't really a salient aspect of these fascist organisations and their ideologies. So fascism can't be read off from the ideological commitments of a movement. We need a more dynamic understanding of fascism, one that understands it not as a set of ideological commitments, but rather as a strategy, as a perspective, and as a political force that serves certain, I don't know if you want to put it this way, but functions or roles in society, and also fits within the dynamics of a society which is in crisis. And this is why I've gone back to Marxist interpretations of fascism, not in order to be doctrinaire, but because I looked at the phenomenon of this far-right street movement in Britain, and this was the framework that I thought best provided resources to be able to understand it. And particularly I'm leaning on the writings of interwar Marxists who were analysing fascism in the 1920s and the 1930s, primarily Leon Trotsky, but also Clara Zetkin, August Thalheimer, Antonio Gramsci in Italy, and so on. What's the key characteristic of fascism that emerges from these Marxist analyses? Well, first and foremost, what they say is that fascism is a movement that develops in a period of social crisis when the hegemony of the elite, the political influence and leadership of the elite over traditionally loyal conservative sections of the population begins to break down because of the sharpness of the political, economic and social crisis which is taking place. And if you read Trotsky talking about German fascism, talking about Nazism, he particularly associates this with the lower middle classes, with what he refers to as the petty bourgeoisie, with small business owners and so on. And when this happens, you can see the creation of a movement that splits away from that hegemony and says that it's both against the elite and against the state and against the capitalist system in a sort of strange way, but also says that it's against the left, against the unions and against the organised working class. And what emerges from this movement is an aura that the theorist Alberto Toscano recently has talked about as an aura of pseudo-insurgency, which is that the movement claims that it wants to overturn the system, claims that it wants to get rid of the current elite, but in fact it's really geared towards suppressing the left, suppressing progressive movements from change, and so on, and doing this through the mobilization from below of these sort of popular sections of the population, which are instinctually opposed to the left and to the organised working class and trade unions and so on. And actually, if you engage with what Robinson says, I think that you see this very clearly. I detail this in the article. He re-emerged really as a street leader in the current period in 2023, right? What was taking place in that time, at the end of 2023? Of course, there was the emergence of this enormous Palestine movement, and also the emergence of this moral panic driven by the Tory government, driven by Suella Braverman as, some people's faces like, oh my god, driven by Suella Braverman as the Home Secretary, and driven by the press and the media as well. And his play was to step into that and say, I am the person who can assemble forces on the street that can attempt to put the Palestine movement back into the box. You remember there was a big moral panic about the idea that the Palestine movement was going to march on the Cenotaph on Remembrance Day. Suella Braverman basically came out and tacitly backed Tommy Robinson against the quote-unquote hate marches, as though he wouldn't himself be leading a hate march or whatever. And this is the way that he reinserted himself into the political situation and began to reconstitute his forces on the street. It is no coincidence whatsoever that the next demonstration that he's called is on the 16th of May in central London. Why has he done this? Because it's Nakba Day. Because he wanted to go up against the Palestine movement. At the core of his project is really this anti-leftism, this desire to attack progressive movements. He has form on this. A previous time that he attempted to do this was during the pandemic, when the Black Lives Matter movement occurred. And then he was trying to mobilise people on the streets to, defend the statues and so on and so forth. You see him do this again and again. When progressive movements come onto the streets, he mobilises as a counterforce in order to attack them. It goes far as back as the EDL, to be honest. In those with long memories, in the early 2010s, when the EDL was mobilising to try to attack the Occupy encampment in London at St Paul's Cathedral in 2011, 2012. So he has absolute form on this, and Islamophobia and racism against refugees, it's a glue that binds together his movement, but at a deeper level he's really shaping a spear that can be directed against the neck of progressive movements in Britain. And this is very interesting, I think, because if you use this analytical framework, you can start to see some of the ways in which his ideology and the previous forms of fascist ideology that we can investigate historically actually have certain parallels, despite the fact that on the superficial level, the content of them is somewhat different. Okay. In Nazi Germany, obviously the figure of the Jew is incredibly ideologically important. The core ideological function of the figure of the Jew in Nazi ideology is to say that there's a conspiracy against the nation that involves, on the one hand, the elite, but then on the other hand, the left, the communists, the socialists, the trade unions, and so on. The idea of the Jew is that the Jew is both the communist shop steward on the factory floor who's agitating for revolution, but the Jew is also the banker. It's the idea of the top and the bottom working together. And if you look at the way in which Great Replacement conspiracy theory has come to play this really central ideological role in what Robinson is saying and what he's doing, I think that it plays actually quite a similar role. The idea of Great Replacement theory is not just that there's an elite conspiracy to replace white people in Britain and Europe and North America with people from Africa and Muslims and Arab populations and people from Asia and so on. The other thing that it's saying is that actually as part of that conspiracy, feminism, changes in sexual relationships between men and women, LGBT plus activists, sexual liberalism, if you want to put it that way, all of these forces from below are actually part of that coordinated conspiracy as well, because they're trying to, push down white birth rates. They're trying to weaken the traditional position of white men, and ultimately they're trying to destroy the nation. So there's this interesting parallel there between these two different forms of ideology, which superficially seem very, very different. But if you look at the core of them, actually they're about the same thing. The idea that the elite and the left work together, and that we're the only true people who can mount resistance against these two forces, which are actually controlled by the same conspiracy behind the curtain, so to speak. And it's an articulation of conspiracist ideology which services that sense of pseudo-ideology. The idea that you hate the elite, but actually your main political drive is to try to divide the working class against itself and to destroy the left. And this is why I say that Robertson is engaged in a counter-revolutionary project. And, in this way that there's a certain affinity between his project and interwar fascism, because interwar fascism largely arose in national situations where there had already been a revolution which had failed, and then these forces emerged as counter-revolutionary forces which would attempt to stop that happening again. Now, I'm obviously not claiming that there's just been a failed revolution in Britain. I'm not claiming that revolution is on the immediate horizon in Britain. But I think that we have to take Robinson at his own word, because I'm not the first person to call Tommy Robinson a counter-revolutionary. I don't know whether I'm the second, but definitely the first is Tommy Robinson himself. As I say in the article, he stood there on the stage on the 13th of September and he said this: "We are the counter-revolution." But it reveals something about his perspective, that behind every progressive social development, behind every progressive social movement in Britain, he sees the threat of a social rupture in Britain, and he sees his task as fighting against that by mobilising a physical force from below that can attack migrants, that can attack Muslims, but can also attack progressive movements and the left. Now, I've talked about some of the continuities with classical fascism. I also want to talk about some of the discontinuities as well, and I'll try to conclude in a moment. Because another argument that I make in the article, really, is that Robinson emerged out of the British fascist tradition, right? The tradition of the National Front, of the British National Party, of the British Union of Fascists, and so on. And I think this is an important argument, because in many ways people see him as quite distant from that. People should be reminded, he was a member of the British National Party. You go on Google Images, you can find a picture of him in a BNP meeting in the mid-2000s in Luton, where he's listening to a speaker, and that speaker is Richard Edmonds. Richard Edmonds was a leading member of the British National Party, but he was also an editor of a magazine called Holocaust News, in which he said that the Holocaust was, quote, a preposterous propaganda fantasy, which had been made up by Jewish people. Right, so that's the sort of people that he was associating with in the 2000s. And of course, since then, he's attempted to distance himself from that tradition. He's attempted to loudly embrace Zionism as a sort of strategic mechanism for doing so. He even presents himself as an anti-racist in the most sort of cliched and tokenistic ways possible, like I've got black friends, etc., etc. But I think that, we have to go back to this insight that fascism never creates its ideology from scratch, and instead it radicalises existing forms of reaction. In the 1970s, in the 1980s, really over the past half a century in Britain, there has been a recomposition of the nature of racism in this country. It's not to say that biological racism, that racism based on people's skin colour, is not a central aspect of British society at the moment. It obviously is. But in terms of the official forms of racism, the respectable forms of racism, what we've seen is a transformation towards a culturalist form of racism that basically says, listen, we're not against you because you're black or whatever. We're against you because, you're coming from a different country and a different culture, and how could you possibly integrate into British society and all of that sort of stuff. So what the Robinson Project is really about is it's about refitting the fascist tradition in Britain for the 21st century, and taking up all of those resources which have been produced by state Islamophobia, by the war on terror and so on, and again radicalising that into a fascist, into a new fascist project which actually fits the moment. I need to shut up, don't I?
You do.
Maybe I'll just do that.
You want to stop now?
No, I'll say something by conclusion, otherwise it's...
A minute conclusion.
Listen, I'll point towards something else that I wanted to say, and maybe it'll come out in the discussion and I'll talk about it afterwards. The last thing that I just wanted to gesture towards is the way in which he's reshaped that movement in his own image as well. One of the ideas that I talk about inside of the article is about the idea of deniability. This is a really, really important concept which has been developed through discourse analysis, academic research, into the way in which the far right talks. You know, there's always a strategic ambiguity in the way that they talk. I'll give you the most blatant example. You know when Elon Musk did the Nazi salute, right? And then he was like, oh, I was scratching my head or something. This is the point. You signal to the hardcore what you really believe, that you're with them, and then on the other hand you say, oh no, I didn't mean that at all. And then you fall back on arguments about freedom of speech, you try to create confusion amongst the opposition and all of this sort of stuff. One of the key things that I talk about in the article is that I think that this idea of strategic ambiguity, of deniability, that in the movement at the moment, it's not just a rhetorical device, it's an organising device. Really, the fascist movement in Britain has moved away from its traditional party forms. There's no longer the BNP, there's no longer the National Front, and what you have instead is really Robinson at the top of this movement, but then beneath him, the movement is really distributed, it's not centralised, there's lots of different local organisations, and this creates an ability to say that, you know, the things that my supporters do have nothing to do with me if they go badly, you know. If they commit terrorist attacks, if they engage in violence, that's nothing to do with me. And that's become an important strategic principle in the way in which he organises. But my argument is also that that is shaped by anti-fascist resistance. He organises in this way because he was in the BNP and he knows that we smashed them. He knows that we smashed the National Front. He knows that there is an embedded anti-fascist tradition in this country which is capable of smashing their organisations, and therefore producing the big target of a centralised organisation means that there are weaknesses inside of that we can exploit. And I'll end here. By using this method, he's actually created spectacular results, right? As I say, the biggest fascist-led mobilisation in British history. But at the same time, there's weaknesses inside of that. There is weaknesses inside of that. Look at what actually took place after the 13th of December demonstration. Did it lead to a strengthening of fascist organisation in Britain and a strengthening of the far-right street movement in Britain? Actually, no. The demonstrations have gone down in size in local areas, mostly because of the consistent resistance that they face from anti-fascist organisations, particularly stand up to racism. So there's a weakness in there as well, and that weakness is shaped by decades of anti-fascist resistance and the defeat of the fascist movement in this country. And I think that if we push on those weaknesses, actually we can break this movement in the present as well, and we can break Robinson. Okay.